In this video, you will learn about some of the specific properties of the quadrilaterals that we've already been learning about and discussing. Notice the flowchart looks very similar to the flowchart you had from the last section, except that the diagonals of some of the figures are drawn. So some of this is just going to be review of what we've already talked about with the very basics, but then we're going to get into some more specific properties of these quadrilaterals. Now it's really important that you take time to memorize all these different properties because you are going to be assessed on them in multiple different ways. So I really like this flowchart format because you can really see the relationship between the quadrilaterals. So if I were to ask you, is a rectangle a parallelogram, you can look at the arrows on the flowchart and right away tell me, yes, it is, based upon the arrows. So that's one way of representing them. So let's kind of go through, review some of the characteristics, and also add some characteristics onto what we've already been talking about. So at the very top of this flowchart, we have our quadrilateral. That's the most basic name for a four-sided polygon. So we're not really going to add anything to that definition. We're just going to keep it as a four-sided polygon. From there, we get into some more specific quadrilaterals. So let's move over here to the left, a parallelogram. So a parallelogram, let's just bullet point some of the parallelogram's characteristics. We learned yesterday that opposite sides of parallelogram are parallel. So I'm going to put those parallel tick marks. We know both pairs of opposite sides are parallel. Then we also know that opposite sides and angles are congruent in a parallelogram. So I'm going to put tick marks on its opposite sides. So those two sides would be congruent, and then the other two sides are also going to be congruent. And we know that opposite angles are congruent. So I'm going to put tick marks on the diagonal angles and then put a different kind of tick mark on the other two opposite angles. We also know in a parallelogram that the diagonals bisect each other. So I'm going to put the same kind of tick marks here to indicate that diagonal's been bisected, and then this one also too. The last characteristic that you need to know about a parallelogram is that consecutive angles are supplementary. So consecutive angles means angles that are next to each other. So opposite angles of a parallelogram are congruent, but consecutive angles of a parallelogram, so angles that are next to each other, are supplementary. So those are all the characteristics that you have to know about the parallelogram. So I know that the tick marks can get a little overwhelming and confusing, but the more you practice just labeling the diagrams with all of its tick marks, then the better you'll have all of the characteristics memorized. So moving on, let's look over in the middle here at the kite. The kite from yesterday we know has two disjoint pairs of consecutive sides congruent. So I'm going to label that on my diagram with tick marks. We know that in a kite, one diagonal is the perpendicular bisector of the other. So all those angles in the middle, those are all right angles since we know the diagonals are perpendicular. And since one of the diagonals is the perpendicular bisector of the other, that means only one diagonal in a kite is being bisected. We know that a kite has one pair of opposite angles that's congruent. So in this case, it would be those two angles are congruent. And then the other pair of angles is being bisected by the diagonal. So therefore, those top two smaller angles are congruent to each other, and then the bottom two smaller angles are congruent to each other. So those are all the different properties that you're going to have to know about just a general kite. Moving on over here to the right-hand side, we have our trapezoid, and actually the only thing that we know about just a trapezoid is it has one pair of opposite sides that is parallel. And those parallel sides, those are known as bases. Okay, moving on down the flowchart, the next shape we're going to talk about is a rectangle. A rectangle has all the properties of a parallelogram because notice the arrow pointing to it is the parallelogram. So rather than rewriting it all over again, I'm just going to put parallelogram properties. So I'm going to label my diagram with some of those tick marks. So we know from the parallelogram that both pairs of opposite sides are parallel, so I'm going to put those parallel tick marks. We know that opposite sides are also congruent in a parallelogram, so I'm going to put the congruent tick marks on my opposite sides. We also know that the diagonals of a rectangle not only bisect each other, but they're also congruent. So because they bisect each other and they're congruent, that means all of these smaller segments should have the same kind of tick mark. All 4 of these littler segments are congruent in the rectangle. We also know not only that opposite angles are congruent, but they are all right angles. So it contains 4 right angles. And those are all the properties that you'll need to know with a rectangle. Now moving on to a rhombus, notice that there are 2 arrows pointing at the rhombus, the parallelogram and the kite. So instead of rewriting all those properties, I'm going to just write parallelogram and kite properties. We know that from the parallelogram that opposite sides are parallel. And not only are opposite sides congruent, but actually in a rhombus, all the sides are congruent to each other. So I'm going to put the same tick mark on each of the 4 sides. From the kite, we know that the diagonals are perpendicular, so they all form, so there are 4 right angles in the middle. And not only does it bisect one of the diagonals, but actually both diagonals are perpendicular bisectors of each other. So that would mean that those 2 segments are congruent, and these 2 segments are also congruent. We know that from the parallelogram that opposite angles are congruent to each other. So I'm going to put those tick marks on the opposite angles. And then the last property of a rhombus is that the diagonals bisect the angles. So therefore, since the diagonals are bisecting the angles, that would mean I'm just going to put a little number 1 on these angles. Those 4 angles are congruent where I have the number 1s. And then I'm going to put a number 2 on the other 4 pairs, the other 4 angles that are congruent. So the number 1 angles are congruent and the number 2 angles are all congruent. So those are all the properties you're going to have to know about a rhombus. Moving on to our next quadrilateral, the isosceles trapezoid, because the arrow from the trapezoid is pointing at it, we know that it has all of the trapezoid properties. And the trapezoid property says that the bases are parallel. Then since it is an isosceles trapezoid, we know the non-parallel sides, or the legs, are congruent. So I'm going to put my tick marks on those legs. We know that the upper and lower base angles are congruent. So that means that the top 2 angles are congruent to each other, and then the bottom 2 angles are congruent to each other. The next property is that one upper base and one lower base angle are supplementary. And there really isn't any way to indicate that on the diagram. The last thing that you have to know about an isosceles trapezoid is that the diagonals are congruent. I'm going to just use my highlighter to kind of highlight the diagonals so that you know that they are congruent. So I'm going to highlight them here in blue so that we know those are congruent to each other. So that's everything you have to know about an isosceles trapezoid. Our last quadrilateral is a square. The square is the most complex out of all the quadrilaterals. That's why it is located at the bottom of the flowchart. Now, a square has a rectangle's arrow pointing at it and a rhombus's arrow pointing at it. Both rectangle and rhombus properties. So from the rectangle, we know that opposite sides are parallel. So I'm going to put my parallel tick marks on there. We know that from the rectangle, it has 4 right angles. And then from the rhombus, we know that those 4 right angles are being bisected. So if a right angle is cut in half, each of those angles are going to be equal to 45 degrees. We know that opposite sides are all congruent to each other. Actually, opposite sides are congruent and all four sides are congruent since it's a rhombus, so I put the congruent tick mark. We know that since it's a rhombus that the diagonals are perpendicular bisectors of each other, and since it's a rectangle, those diagonals are also congruent, so they're all going to have the same tick mark. And so those are all of the properties that you'll have to know about a square. So hopefully now you have a better idea of all the different properties of the quadrilaterals that we've been discussing. I know it's a little overwhelming at first, but we are going to be working with these different properties over and over again, and in order to be successful this chapter, you do need to take time to memorize all the properties. So please study the flow chart, or if you prefer note cards, however you learn best, you need to find a way to help you memorize all these characteristics.